Tonight we walk together into a strange and persistent rumour, one that has drifted across old maps and brittle pages like smoke that refuses to vanish. So before I tell you today's story, please take a moment to like the video and subscribe to the channel to receive notifications for future clips and give me some encouragement. As you settle in, I invite you to post your local location and the time you're listening from, so we can imagine this story travelling quietly across the world. Now, let's begin our journey tonight. The oldest maps whisper a shocking idea that somewhere beyond the familiar borders of Europe and Asia lived a people who did not fear sickness the way the rest of humanity always has. You hear it in the margins first, not in bold ink, but in cautious phrases, half believed and half denied. Tartarians, they were called. Hardy, unusual, resistant, and immediately a question settles into your mind like a pebble dropped into still water. What does it mean to say a people resisted disease, when disease has always been humanity's oldest companion? You drift closer to those maps now. In candlelight, the parchment looks alive, its lines swelling and shrinking as if breathing. Tartaria stretches across vast spaces, far larger than any single empire should be. The name alone feels less like a country and more like a condition, a state of being. And beside it, scribbled by careful hands, are observations that seem almost innocent. Fewer outbreaks here, strange endurance there, travellers remarking that yet illness did not spread as expected. Not immunity, not invincibility, just resistance. A subtle word, but a powerful one. Why would such a claim take root? You ask yourself this gently, without judgment. Humans have always looked for islands of safety in a sea of danger. When plague bells rang in European cities, when coughs echoed through narrow streets and death carts creaked at dawn, the idea that somewhere, anywhere, people lived differently must have felt like hope disguised as geography. Perhaps Tartaria was not just a place on the map, but a place in the mind. You imagine yourself as a traveller approaching the edges of this rumoured land. Your body carries the quiet anxiety of your own era's illnesses, your inherited fear of contagion, and yet the stories say that here, among open skies and wide plains, sickness does not leap so easily from breath to breath. Camps move before rot can settle. Fires burn daily, not just for warmth but for ritual, for cleanliness, for something harder to name. Could movement itself be a medicine? Could space be a cure? The map does not answer you. It only invites you further in. You notice how often the rumours emphasise contrast. Where cities are crowded, Tartaria is open. Where stone walls trap air and waste, the steppe releases them to the wind. Where bells toll for the dead, silence reigns, not because no one dies, but because death does not arrive in waves. Is resistance here a biological mystery, or simply the absence of conditions that make disease thrive? You're not asked to decide yet. You're only asked to notice. European chroniclers seem unsettled by this. Their pens hesitate. They describe strong lungs, clear eyes, weathered skin. They remark that travellers recover faster than expected, that fevers pass without ceremony. But beneath the observations, you feel a tremor of discomfort. If disease does not behave the same way everywhere, then perhaps it is not purely divine punishment. Perhaps it is not fate alone, and that thought in its own way is dangerous. So the stories begin to change tone. Practical habits become exotic customs, cleanliness becomes ritual purity, health becomes mystery, and slowly, quietly, resistance begins to sound like something else entirely, like a screw it. You feel how easily this happens. You have seen it in your own time. When something works and we do not understand why, we wrap it in symbolism. We lift it away from the ordinary and place it beyond reach. Tartarian resistance to disease becomes not a set of habits or environments, but a trait, almost a birthright. And birthrights invite envy, fear, and speculation. Some maps add symbols, tiny stars, unexplained markings. Later retellings will call them energy points, magnetic zones, places where the earth itself protects those who know how to live upon it. Is this true? Or is it simply another layer of story laid gently over ignorance? You sit with the question instead of chasing it. The night is not for answers yet. You think about how disease defines borders, not political ones, but invisible lines of fear. Where one illness rages, another place becomes safe, even if only by comparison. Tartaria, vast and poorly understood, becomes the perfect canvas. It is far enough away to hold fantasy, large enough to absorb contradiction. And so the idea grows. A people less touched by plague, less haunted by rot, less bound to the cycle of outbreak and collapse. But notice this. No map ever says never sick. No chronicler writes immortal. The claim is softer, almost tender. Supposed resistance, unexpected endurance, fewer losses, words that suggest probability, not certainty. And yet over time those gentle phrases harden. Resistance becomes immunity, endurance becomes superiority, and superiority, as it always does, invites myth. You let your thoughts slow here. This is not a courtroom, not a debate hall. This is a quiet path through layered memory. You're allowed to wonder without choosing sides. You're allowed to hold two ideas at once, that human bodies are fragile everywhere, and that ways of living can make that fragility more or less visible. The map rustles again. You see trade routes crossing Tartaria like veins. Silk, salt, horses, stories. With trade comes disease, or so the old rule goes. And yet, the rumours insist that caravans pass through without sparking outbreaks. How? Distance between camps. Exposure to cold, smoke-filled air that stings the lungs but cleans the space. Or perhaps simple luck, repeated often enough to look like law. Your mind drifts to the present. How quickly we label some populations resilient and others vulnerable. How often we mistake circumstance for essence. The Tartarian story feels familiar now, not ancient at all. It is the same human reflex wearing older clothes. Still, there is something calming in imagining a place where fear of disease does not dominate daily life, where health is not a battle but a rhythm. Wake, move, breathe, clean, eat simply, sleep under stars. You feel your own breathing slow as you picture it. Perhaps that is why the myth endures, not because it proves anything extraordinary, but because it reminds you of something forgotten. The resistance of Tartaria, real or imagined, becomes a mirror. It asks quietly, how much of sickness is nature and how much is how we live together? How much is destiny and how much is design? Not grand engineering by hidden powers, but the small design of daily habit. You're not done with the mystery. This is only the map, the outline drawn in fading ink. Ahead lie camps, journals, missionaries, healers, and whispers of forbidden knowledge. But for now, you let the map fold closed. You tuck the question into your thoughts like a letter to be opened later. As the night deepens, the idea settles gently beside you. Tartaria as a land untouched by disease may never have existed as imagined, but the longing behind the idea that humans could live in balance with their bodies and their world feels very real indeed. And so you rest here, on the edge of the story, breathing slowly, letting the map dissolve into darkness, knowing that with each step forward, the myth will grow quieter, and the human truth beneath it will begin to speak. The story carries you forward without asking permission, slipping from ink and parchment into the hush of a travelling night. You find yourself beside a caravan at rest, its wagons drawn into a loose circle like tired animals curling inward for warmth. The air smells of smoke and wool and something faintly sour, fermented milk warming near a fire. This is the place where sickness should thrive. Close bodies, shared cups, long roads, and yet the old accounts insist something is different here. You listen carefully now because this is where the rumours sharpen. A cough breaks the silence, just one, and it turns heads, but not in panic. No one recoils, no one flees. The sound is noted, acknowledged, and then released back into the night. You feel how strange that is, even to you. In your world, a cough carries weight. It travels faster than words. It awakens inherited fear. But here it dissolves into the wind. Why? You walk among the figures, quiet as a thought. Faces are weathered, eyes steady. They move with an ease that suggests familiarity not only with one another, but with the land itself. There is no clustering, no tight knot of bodies pressed together for safety. Space is allowed, even valued. Children drift between fires, not clinging, not confined, and you begin to sense that distance here is not loneliness, it is protection. The caravan does not stay long in one place. This detail repeats again and again in the records, though often it is dismissed as mere nomadic restlessness. But you feel its significance now. Stagnation is the ally of disease. Still air, still water, still waste. Here, nothing stays still for long. Before rot can take hold, the people move. Before illness can settle into a pattern, the pattern itself changes. You watch as bedding is shaken out each morning, exposed deliberately to cold air and sun. Smoke drifts through tents not only for warmth but for cleansing. The smell is sharp, eye-watering, uncomfortable, and you realize how often comfort and health stand on opposite sides of the same choice. What feels harsh may protect, what feels cozy may conceal danger. European travellers noticed this, though they did not always understand it. They wrote of smoky camps and irritating fumes, complaining of sore throats and stinging eyes. Yet in the same pages they admit something unexpected. Fevers that troubled them before arriving seem to fade. Wounds heal cleanly. Stomach sickness passes quickly. They do not celebrate this, they report it with unease. You sense why. To admit that such simple practices could blunt illness would mean admitting that suffering back home was not inevitable. That stone cities, narrow streets, and layered filth were choices, not destiny. It was easier to call Tartarian health natural or worse, unnatural. As night deepens, you notice how food is handled. Broth simmers long enough to kill what cannot be seen. Fermented drinks bubble quietly, already transformed by friendly microbes into something safer than raw water. Meat is dried, salted, smoked, methods born not of luxury, but of necessity. There is nothing decorative about these habits. They are survival etched into routine, and yet later retellings will strip away this practicality. They will replace it with mystery. They will say Tartarians possessed secret bodies, special blood, unknown genes. You feel the distortion beginning here in this simple camp, because acknowledging habit is less exciting than inventing essence, because discipline is less romantic than destiny. Another cough echoes, closer this time. A child. A hand touches the child's back, not dramatically, just present. The child is moved slightly away from the fire, into cooler air. Warmth is controlled, not excessive. Sweating is watched carefully. You realize how different this is from the instinct to bundle, to trap heat at all costs. Cold here is not the enemy. It is a tool. The wind rises, carrying away smoke, breath, scent. You imagine disease as something that tries to linger, to cling. Here it is denied that pleasure. Everything is encouraged to move on. You remember how later myths claim Tartarians did not fear death. But watching them now, you see something else. They are attentive, observant, responsive. They do not deny illness. They manage it early, quietly, without spectacle. There are no bells, no rituals of alarm, only small adjustments, distance, rest, air, time. This subtlety is easy to miss. Outsiders often mistake drama for effectiveness. If healing does not look miraculous, it is dismissed. If prevention leaves no visible hero, it is forgotten. And so what works best often becomes invisible. You sit near the fire and listen to low voices. Stories are shared but not shouted. Laughter rises and falls. The rhythm of speech itself feels regulated, as if conserving energy. You wonder if even this, measured breath, unhurried talk, plays a role. Stress weakens, panic spreads faster than pathogens, calm in its quiet way protects. In the distance, animals shift and snort. They are kept at the edge of camp, not interwoven with sleeping bodies. Waste is carried away, deliberately downwind. These details sound mundane, almost boring, and yet they form a pattern so consistent it becomes a kind of shield. Later centuries will search for grand explanations. They will speak of Tartarian frequencies, energy fields, magnetic alignments. You feel the temptation of those ideas. They sparkle, they promise hidden mastery. But standing here, under stars, the truth feels heavier and simpler. Health is not hidden, it is practiced. Still, you do not dismiss the mystery entirely. You notice how well adapted these people are to cold, to hunger, to long rides and short sleep. Bodies trained from childhood respond differently to stress. Immune systems, though unnamed here, learn through exposure rather than avoidance. Illness, when it comes, meets a body already accustomed to challenge. Is this resistance? Yes, in a sense. But it is not magic. It is relationship between body and environment, habit and outcome. And relationships, once misunderstood, easily become myths. You think about how stories travel faster than facts. A traveller falls ill in a city, recovers in a caravan and draws a conclusion. Another hears it second-hand and embellishes. By the time it reaches a chronicler, the cough that faded becomes proof of immunity. The ordinary becomes extraordinary. The night grows colder. People wrap themselves in felted fur, materials that breathe rather than seal. You feel the balance again, warmth without suffocation, protection without enclosure. Everything here seems to resist excess. Too much heat, too much closeness, too much stillness, these are avoided instinctively. And you begin to understand how a rumour is born not from deception, but from contrast. When two ways of living meet, one will always look impossible to the other. The caravan does not feel miraculous to itself. It feels normal. It is the outsider who feels transformed, confused and compelled to explain the change. As dawn approaches, the camp begins to loosen. Fires are doused. Ashes scattered. The ground is left almost as it was found. No accumulation, no memory for disease to inhabit. And with that movement, the story shifts again. You realize now that Tartarian resistance to disease may never have been a single secret or trait. It may have been motion itself, the refusal to settle long enough for decay, physical or social, to take hold. Empires love permanence, roads, walls, monuments, but permanence invites stagnation, and stagnation invites illness. This idea will trouble future historians. It does not fit neatly into narratives of progress. How can moving lightly be more advanced than building heavily? How can leaving few traces be mistaken for ignorance rather than wisdom? The caravan fades behind you as the sun lifts. You carry with you the image of that single cough, unafraid, unanswered by panic. It lingers in your thoughts, gentle and unresolved. And as you continue this journey, you understand that the mystery of Tartarian health will not be solved by discovering something hidden, but by noticing what was always in plain sight. Quiet habits, repeated patiently until they looked like legend to those who had forgotten how to live that way. You move forward as if turning a page that resists slightly, the paper stiff with age and salt. Now you are no longer beside a fire, but bent over journals carried across seas and borders, written by hands that tremble between curiosity and unease. These are the European explorer's notes, and as you read them, you feel how the tone shifts. The caravan night is replaced by candlelit desks. The open plain becomes something measured, judged and compared. The first thing you notice is surprise. Not admiration yet, just surprise. They endure, one writer notes almost grudgingly. They fall ill less than expected. Another pauses mid-sentence, as if unsure whether to trust his own observation. You can sense the discomfort. These men came with expectations shaped by their own world. Cold equals danger, smoke equals filth, movement equals disorder. And yet, here are people thriving within those very conditions. You follow the ink slowly, letting the words breathe. One explorer writes of arriving exhausted, coughing, his chest tight from weeks of damp lodging in port cities. He expects the steppe to finish him. Instead, after days among the Tartarians, he records a strange recovery. His appetite returns. His sleep deepens. The cough fades. He does not know how to frame this, so he frames it carefully, cautiously as an exception. Another describes children running barefoot on frozen ground, their skin unbroken, their laughter unrestrained. To him, this borders on the unnatural. He uses words like inhuman tolerance and unnatural constitution. You feel the fear beneath the ink. If such endurance is learned rather than inherited, then it could, in theory, be taught, and that idea threatens hierarchies far more than illness ever could. You notice how often these journals compare bodies. European bodies are described as softened, unaccustomed, fragile in the cold. Tartarian bodies are hardened, weathered, trained. But instead of asking how this training occurs, many writers stop at the description. Description feels safer than inquiry. Inquiry might demand change. Some explorers try to explain the difference through bloodlines. They suggest ancient ancestry, foreign origins, even non-human descent. These explanations feel dramatic, but you can sense their convenience. It is easier to imagine a different species than to accept that one's own society has chosen poorly. Biology becomes an excuse where culture would be an accusation. You pause at a particularly revealing passage. A traveller notes that when illness does occur among the Tartarians, it is treated quietly. There is no spectacle, no public prayer, no mass panic. The sick are moved gently away from others, given rest, air, simple food. They do not dramatize disease, he writes, almost offended, as if suffering must be visible to be legitimate. You think about how Europe at the time treated illness, with bells, processions, crowded infirmaries, shared dread. Fear itself becomes communal. Disease becomes identity. And here among the Tartarians, illness remains an event, not a definition. It happens, then it passes, or it does not, and death is accepted without theatre. This lack of drama unsettles the writers. They do not know how to report it. Drama sells stories. Calm does not. And so calm becomes suspect, calm becomes secretive, calm becomes evidence of something hidden. One explorer speculates about air quality. He mentions the constant wind, the absence of stagnant smells. But then he abandons the thought, perhaps because it sounds too ordinary. Another mentions diet, but dismisses it as simple fare, unworthy of note. You see how the answers appear briefly, then slip away, ignored because they do not fit the hunger for mystery. As you read further, the language begins to shift. What started as observation becomes interpretation. They seem less subject to pestilence, becomes they are resistant. Resistance becomes immunity. Immunity becomes unnatural protection, and with each step, the distance between reality and myth grows wider. You feel no anger toward these writers, only a soft understanding. They were men of their time, trained to see the world through certain lenses. They believed civilization meant walls, permanence, density. A society that thrived without those markers appeared incomplete, even threatening. And so its health had to be explained away. Some journals hint at envy. The explorers write of longing to adopt certain habits, sleeping outdoors, bathing in steam, breathing smoke, but they quickly retreat from the idea. Such practices would not be accepted back home. They would be ridiculed. Worse, they would challenge authority. If peasants could be healthier by changing daily habits, what would that still say about kings and bishops? And so the story shifts again. Tartarian health becomes something innate, not transferable. A closed system. A curiosity, not a lesson. You notice how often the explorers emphasize physical stature. Broad chests, strong limbs, endurance on horseback. Disease resistance becomes folded into a general narrative of strength. But strength is visible, immunity is not. The two are fused, confused. The invisible is explained by the visible. Later retellings will isolate these descriptions, stripping them of context. They will quote phrases like rarely sick and remarkable constitution without the surrounding details of air, movement, and habit. You can almost see the scissors cutting through the text, shaping a cleaner, more sensational story. You linger on a final journal entry. The writer admits something unexpected. He says that after leaving Tartarian lands and returning to cities, his old ailments return, the cough, the fatigue, the recurring fevers. He does not accuse the city, he blames his own weakness, but you hear the truth beneath the self-reproach. The environment matters. This realization is dangerous. It suggests that health is not evenly distributed by God, but influenced by choices, structures, and values. It suggests responsibility, and responsibility, once recognized, cannot be unseen. So the journals are closed. The writers return home. Their notes circulate, summarized, edited, filtered. Over time, the careful uncertainty is lost. The hedging language disappears. What remains is a simplified idea. The Tartarians were resistant to disease. You sit with that idea now, not as a fact to be proven or dismissed, but as a story shaped by fear, wonder, and misunderstanding. You feel how easily admiration turns into othering, how quickly observation becomes myth when it threatens comfort. The explorers did not lie, but they did not fully see either. They looked at Tartarian health through the narrow window of their own world, and the view was distorted by the glass itself. As you close the last journal, the ink fades back into darkness. The voice is quiet. Ahead lie other witnesses, missionaries, healers, record keepers, each adding their own layer to the tale. For now, you rest in the space between what was observed and what was believed, knowing that in that space, myths are born gently, almost lovingly, from the human need to explain what challenges are most. You move onward, and the voices around you change again. The explorers fade into the background, and now you hear quieter men, trained to listen more than to marvel. These are the missionaries, the Jesuits especially, moving carefully through Tartarian lands with notebooks held close to the chest, with eyes trained not only on souls but on habits. They do not shout in their writing. They whisper. And whispers, often carry more weight than proclamations. Their reports do not begin with miracles, they begin with discipline. You notice how often they describe routines. Morning washing with cold water, even in winter. Smoke-filled enclosures used deliberately, not avoided. The burning of herbs whose names are half translated, half ignored. Juniper, wormwood, bitter roots crushed and steeped. The missionaries do not call these medicines at first, they call them customs, and in doing so they almost miss their importance. One Jesuit notes, with faint irritation, that Tartarian camps smell constantly of smoke, and that the people seem unbothered by the discomfort. He complains of headaches, watering eyes, and then, almost as an afterthought, he adds that outbreaks of fever are rare, and that wounds do not fester as expected. The contradiction sits there, unresolved, like a knot left untied. You feel the tension in these writings. The Jesuits are trained men, educated, observant. They believe in order, hierarchy, cleanliness of the soul. But here they encounter a different kind of order, one not written in books, not enforced by walls or bells, but lived through repetition, and it unsettles them. They notice that the sick are not gathered together in communal buildings. There are no infirmaries, no hospitals as they understand them. Instead, illness is treated as something temporary, localized. The unwell are given space, fresh air, warmth without suffocation. Visitors are limited, not out of fear, but out of habit. The Jesuits search for prayer rituals, anointings, signs of divine intervention. They find very little of that. What they find instead feels almost practical. This is troubling, because if health can be maintained through routine rather than ritual, then where does spiritual authority fit? The missionaries do not deny God's role, but they struggle to insert him into a system that appears to function quietly on its own. So they do what humans have always done when confronted with uncomfortable effectiveness. They reframe it. They begin to speak of guarded knowledge, of remedies not shared freely, of healers who operate in silence, of customs passed down but never explained. These statements are not entirely false, but they are incomplete. Knowledge passed through practice does not always announce itself. A child learns by watching, not by being lectured. To an outsider, this looks like secrecy. You pause with a particular report written in careful Latin. A Jesuit describes observing a steam practice, people entering a low structure filled with heat and smoke, sweating intensely, then stepping out into cold air. He is alarmed. He expects collapse. Instead, he sees laughter, alertness, vigor. He compares it reluctantly to Roman baths, then dismisses the comparison as insufficient. They lack refinement, he says, but you hear the envy beneath the word. Another missionary describes herbal mixtures given at the first sign of illness, before fever takes hold, before weakness deepens. Early intervention. He does not call it that, but you recognize the principle. Disease here is not allowed to grow into drama. It is addressed early, quietly, without ceremony. The Jesuits note this with suspicion. Why no prayers? Why no confession? Why no public acknowledgement of divine judgment? And then comes the word that changes everything. Miracle. In later summaries, editors and translators soften the reports, then sharpen them. What was once effective habit becomes mysterious cure. What was once early response becomes unnatural recovery. The missionaries themselves may not have intended this shift, but once their writings leave their hands, they belong to the hunger of others. You feel the danger of that hunger. Europe, still haunted by plague, wants miracles. It wants proof that God favours some people more than others. And if Tartarians appear healthier, then perhaps they are either blessed or damned. Both interpretations serve the same purpose: distance. One Jesuit wrestles openly with this. He writes that Tartarians do not seem more pious nor less. They pray, but not excessively. They honour spirits, ancestors, patterns of nature. Their health, he admits, does not seem tied to righteousness. This troubles him deeply. He leaves the observation without conclusion. That silence is important, because silence invites imagination, and imagination, when fueled by fear, fills gaps with grandeur. Soon the idea spreads that Tartarian healers possess forbidden knowledge, that they guard cures deliberately, that they know something about the body others do not, and from there it is only a small step to claiming that such knowledge was later suppressed, erased, hidden away. You do not dismiss this entirely. History is full of lost practices, but you also sense how easily suppression narratives attach themselves to health myths. When people suffer, they want someone to blame. If they are sick while others appear well, the explanation must involve theft, secrecy, or conspiracy. The Jesuits, caught in the middle, become unwilling midwives to the legend. Their careful notes are quoted without context. Their uncertainties are removed, their observations are transformed into proof of something extraordinary. Yet if you listen closely, beneath the layers, you hear a simpler truth repeating. Clean air, controlled heat, early care, movement, diet, distance, smoke, water. None of these are secrets. They are just inconvenient. They require effort. They require letting go of comfort and habit. The missionaries themselves sometimes try to adopt these practices. Briefly, a few mention feeling stronger, sleeping better, but they also mention ridicule from their peers, discomfort, longing for familiar stone rooms and thick bedding. Change is hard, especially when it threatens identity, and so the practices remain theirs, not ours. Tartarian health remains externalized, othered. It is not something to be learned, but something to be explained away. You feel the story tightening now. What began as observation has become suggestion. Suggestion becomes suspicion. Suspicion becomes myth. And all the while, the actual people, their routines, their choices, their quiet intelligence fade into the background. As you leave the Jesuit reports behind, you carry with you their whispering tone. Not the certainty of doctrine, but the unease of witnesses who saw something working and did not know how to name it without undermining everything they had been taught. Ahead, the story will turn from words to actions, from reports to daily life. You'll watch habits repeat, foods prepared, bodies trained, and slowly, gently, the mystery will begin to lose its sharp edges. But for now, you rest with the whispers. You let them soften, you let them settle, and you remind yourself that the most powerful knowledge rarely announces itself. It simply works, quietly, until someone far away decides it must be something more than it is. You drift onward as if the land itself is guiding you now, away from ink and argument and back into the texture of daily life. The whispers of missionaries fade, replaced by quieter sounds, the splash of water, the sigh of wind across grass, the low creak of leather and wood. This is where the mystery softens, where the extraordinary begins to look ordinary again, if you are willing to look slowly. You watch a morning begin. Before the sun has fully lifted, people are already awake, not hurried, not tense. Water is fetched from streams or melted from ice, cold enough to bite the skin. Faces are washed deliberately. Hands linger longer than comfort would suggest. Cold water is not avoided here. It is invited. You feel your own instinct to flinch, and you recognize it as learned fear rather than necessity. European observers once called this barbaric. You feel how strange that word sounds now. Barbaric for washing. Barbaric for waking the body fully, honestly, without insulating it from the world. What they mistook for cruelty, you now sense as training, not of the muscles alone, but of the nervous system itself. The body learns day after day that cold does not mean death, and in learning that, it relaxes. Relaxation is a kind of medicine no one wrote about back then. You follow the water as it flows away from camp. Waste is carried with it, never allowed to pool nearby. This detail is repeated so often in quiet descriptions that it becomes invisible. There is no reverence attached to it. It is simply how things are done. And yet, you know how rarely such discipline is maintained in settled cities, where convenience slowly erodes intention. Wind moves constantly across the open plain. It dries surfaces, carries scent away, breaks the invisible bridges that disease prefers to travel. You imagine how shocked a city dweller would be by this openness. No walls to trap warmth, no narrow alleys to hold breath and rot. Space itself becomes a protective layer. You think about how often health is imagined as something added, medicine taken, treatments applied. Here, health seems more like something allowed by not interfering too much, allowed by not building barriers where none are needed. You notice clothing next. Wool, felt, fur, materials that insulate without sealing. They breathe. Moisture escapes. Skin remains dry. Again, a small detail, almost boring, but disease loves dampness. It loves trapped sweat and unventilated warmth. The Tartarian approach does not eliminate cold, it manages it. It does not eliminate heat, it releases it. In later centuries, this balance will be misunderstood as recklessness. They expose themselves, me, critics will say, but you see exposure here is measured, not careless. The body is challenged gently, consistently, until challenge becomes familiarity. Midday arrives, and with it food. Simple, repetitive, nourishing. Broths simmer for hours. Grains are soaked, fermented, transformed before being eaten. Milk becomes yogurt, kefir, airag, foods already partially digested by time and microbes. You feel how these processes lighten the burden on the body, how they feed not just hunger but resilience. European visitors often dismiss this diet as monotonous, but monotony, you realize, is stability. Stability allows the body to predict, to prepare, to allocate resources wisely. Excess variety, excess richness, these strain systems designed for rhythm, not surprise. You sit and watch people eat slowly, not ceremonially, not hurried. Eating is not entertainment here, it is refueling. Waste is minimal. Leftovers are reused, transformed, dried. Nothing lingers long enough to spoil nearby. Cleanliness emerges again, not as obsession, but as consequence of attention. Smoke returns in the afternoon. Fires are built intentionally, not only for warmth but for air treatment. Juniper branches crackle, bitter scents fill the space. You feel your eyes sting again, and you understand why outsiders complained. Smoke is uncomfortable, it demands tolerance, but it also sterilizes, repels insects, dries surfaces. It is both irritant and protector. How often do humans reject what helps because it does not feel pleasant? Children move freely through this environment, absorbing its rhythms without instruction. They learn by being present. They learn that cold passes, that heat can be endured, that hunger comes and goes, that bodies recover. This learning imprints deeply. Later, when illness approaches, their systems respond calmly, not with panic. You think about panic now, how it tightens breath, accelerates heartbeats, weakens immunity before any pathogen arrives. Here, panic has little room to grow. Life is not optimized for comfort, so discomfort does not signal catastrophe. As the evening approaches, camps shift slightly. Bedding is aired, ground is cleared, nothing is left to accumulate. You see how this constant micro-movement prevents the build-up of unseen threats. Stagnation is treated as the enemy, even if no one names it that way. European observers once struggled to understand why Tartarians moved camps even when land seemed abundant. They assumed restlessness, lack of foresight. But you see something else now. Movement is hygiene. Movement is prevention. When night falls, sleep comes quickly. There is no artificial extension of waking hours, no candle-lit indulgence into exhaustion. Bodies rest when darkness arrives. Immune systems repair themselves in the quiet, uninterrupted rhythms of natural sleep. Another unglamorous detail. Another overlooked miracle. You think again about resistance to disease. How tempting it is to imagine a shield, a barrier, a special trait. But watching this day unfold, you sense resistance emerging not from defense, but from alignment. The body aligned with environment, habit aligned with biology, community aligned with space. This alignment does not guarantee safety. People still fall ill, injuries still happen, lives still end. But illness does not cascade into catastrophe. It does not spread unchecked. It does not define generations. And here, quietly, the myth begins to unravel, not as disappointment, but as relief. You realize that if Tartarian resistance were truly magical, it would be unreachable. But if it is practical, embodied, learned, then it is both less dramatic and more hopeful. You understand now how later storytellers, separated from these details, would struggle to believe this. It is easier to imagine lost technology than lost discipline, easier to imagine secret knowledge than forgotten habits, easier to believe in suppression than in neglect. The wind slows as night deepens, smoke thins, bodies settle into rest. Nothing here announces itself as extraordinary, and yet everything works together with quiet precision. You let this image soften your thoughts. Health not as conquest, but as cooperation. Resistance not as armor, but as flexibility. Disease not as an enemy, but as a consequence of imbalance. As sleep pulls gently at your awareness, you sense that the mystery you came seeking is already changing shape. It's becoming less about Tartaria and more about humanity itself, about what we choose to endure, what we choose to avoid, and what we slowly forget when comfort becomes our highest value. The day fades, the habits remain, and you carry them with you, not as instructions but as possibilities, drifting softly in the dark. You move forward again, and the rhythm of the story slows, as if inviting you to sit closer, to lean in towards the fire, and listen not to voices, but to simmering pots and the soft sound of chewing. This is where the legend of Tartarian resistance to disease takes on a flavour, literally, and where myth so often hides inside the ordinary act of eating. You watch food being prepared, not as performance, but as repetition, the same motions day after day. Knives scrape gently against wood, bones crack open and sink into water. Time does most of the work here. Long hours of heat transform what was once tough and lifeless into something warm, digestible, forgiving. Broth becomes the foundation of life, not a delicacy, a constant. You feel the significance of this immediately. Broth carries minerals pulled slowly from bone and marrow. It is gentle on the stomach. It asks little of a body that may already be tired, cold, or stressed. When illness approaches, the body does not have to fight both hunger and infection at once. The food itself cooperates. European visitors rarely lingered on this detail. They wrote instead of feasts and scarcity, of meat and hunger. They missed the in-between, the quiet nourishment that does not impress but sustains. And yet it is here in these uncelebrated meals that resilience quietly builds. You notice fermented foods everywhere. Milk transformed into airag, yogurt, kefir. Grains soaked, soured, softened before cooking. Vegetables preserved rather than left to rot. Fermentation is not framed as science here. It is instinct, inherited and trusted. The food is already alive, already broken down, already working with the body instead of against it. You sense how this might have appeared mysterious to outsiders. Fermentation feels like controlled decay. It requires trust in processes unseen. To a mind trained to fear spoilage, this trust looks reckless or magical. Later retellings will call these foods tonics, elixirs, even immune potions. But sitting here, you understand that they are simply food prepared patiently. The taste is sharp, sour, sometimes bitter. Not comforting in the way sugar comforts, but bitterness, you realize, signals complexity. It stimulates digestion. It wakes the body. Sweetness soothes, but bitterness trains. And training appears again and again in Tartarian life. You think about how illness often begins in the gut, how digestion and immunity are not separate systems, but intertwined conversations. Here, that conversation is supported daily, not only when sickness arrives. There is no sudden intervention, only continuity. You watch children drink fermented milk without ceremony. Their bodies grow up expecting it. There is no shock, no adjustment. Later, when foreign travellers attempt the same, their stomachs rebel. The travellers write of strange tolerance, of unnatural digestion. You smile softly. What they experienced was not unnatural digestion, but unfamiliar adaptation. Diet becomes destiny when it is practiced consistently over generations, not genetically, but rhythmically. Bodies learn what to expect. Immune systems learn what is normal. Stability again emerges as a quiet protector. Meat is eaten, but not excessively. When animals are slaughtered, everything is used. Organs, marrow, fat, nothing is wasted. Fat especially is valued, not as indulgence, but as insulation. In cold climates, fat is not the enemy. It is survival stored. You sense how modern fear of fat would sound absurd here, almost dangerous. Salt appears often, but not recklessly. Enough to preserve, not enough to dehydrate. Again, balance. Again, restraint. Extremes are avoided not by rule, but by experience passed down quietly so. You recall how later myths describe Tartarians as superhuman, capable of enduring hunger for days without weakness. Watching now, you see how that myth grows. When the body is well fed consistently, occasional scarcity does not devastate it. Resilience is mistaken for magic. Herbs enter the picture gently. Not rare plants guarded by elites, but common roots and leaves known to everyone. Bitter teas brewed in the evening. Aromatic infusions taken at the first sign of discomfort. You feel how early response matters more than dramatic cure. Illness is not waited on, it is met at the door. European chroniclers sometimes describe these herbs as poisonous or dangerous, unfamiliar with bitterness as medicine. They wrote of Tartarians consuming plants unsuited for Christian stomachs. But you notice how rarely these writers mention prolonged sickness afterward. Their words betray their bodies. Food here is seasonal, not global. What grows locally is eaten locally. Preservation extends seasons but does not erase them. The body moves through cycles with the land. You feel how this rhythmic change prevents excess accumulation. Nothing overwhelms the system for too long. You think about how modern diets often aim for constancy. Same flavors, same textures, same abundance year-round. The Tartarian way does the opposite. It teaches adaptation gently, regularly. Small stresses build strength. Large shocks are avoided. As the evening approaches, you notice how little food is eaten at night. Heavy meals are avoided. Sleep is protected. Digestion does not compete with repair. Another small choice, another invisible benefit. You reflect on how easily this could be misunderstood. To an outsider, this diet looks sparse, lacking luxury, deprived, and yet deprivation is not what you feel here. You feel sufficiency, enough without excess, enough without strain. Later conspiracy narratives will claim Tartarians possessed special crops, lost superfoods, grains no longer available. You understand the appeal of that idea. It preserves mystery. But sitting here, tasting what they taste, you sense that the power lies not in rarity, but in restraint. Any food eaten mindfully, consistently becomes medicine. Any diet built on patience rather than pleasure becomes protective. This truth is too simple to sell, too unglamorous to mythologize honestly. So it is dressed up, exaggerated, transformed into legend. You remember the phrase resistant to disease and how heavy it sounded at the beginning of this journey. Now it feels lighter, less absolute. Resistance here is not a wall, but a slope. Illness can climb it, but slowly with effort, often losing momentum before reaching the top. You feel how this reframes the entire story. Tartarians were not untouched by disease. They were less hospitable to it. Their bodies were not sealed. They were prepared. As night deepens, you watch the last pot being scraped clean. Nothing is left to sit overnight. Cleanliness again, emerging naturally from routine. No rats attracted. No decay invited. Health protected without ever being named. You let your thoughts slow. You feel your own breathing deepen as if mirroring the steady rhythm of this life. You realize that food here is not about pleasure or performance. It is about trust. Trust in time, in simplicity, in the body's ability to respond when not constantly overwhelmed. And so another layer of the mystery dissolves. Not into disappointment, but into quiet clarity. The legend of Tartarian immunity does not vanish. It transforms. It becomes something more human, more reachable, more humbling. You rest with that feeling, warm and unhurried, as the fire settles into embers and the taste of sour milk and rich broth lingers softly into memory. Proof that sometimes the strongest armor is built one simple meal at a time. You continue without noticing the moment when eating gives way to breathing, when nourishment shifts from what enters the mouth to what fills the lungs. The transition feels natural, almost inevitable. Food builds the body, yes, but breath teaches it how to endure. You become aware of breathing here in a way you rarely are elsewhere. The air is cold now, sharper than before, and you watch how people meet it without hesitation. There is no dramatic inhalation, no bracing panic. Breath enters slowly, deeply through the nose. The chest expands wide, unguarded. Shoulders remain low. Even at rest, the body looks prepared, as if it has rehearsed this moment countless times, which, of course, it has. European observers sometimes wrote that Tartarians breathed differently. They did not know how else to describe what they were seeing. The rhythm was slower, the breath quieter. There was no constant sighing, no shallow gulping of air. You feel how this alone would have changed everything. Calm breathing steadies the nervous system. It lowers inflammation before it begins. It keeps fear from becoming a background hum. But again, this is not taught through instruction. No one gathers the children to lecture them on breath. They learn by living, by riding long distances, by sleeping outdoors, by enduring cold without panic. Breath adapts because life requires it to. You watch young riders move across the plain, their posture relaxed yet alert. They do not hunch against the wind, they open to it. Spines stay tall, chests remain broad. This posture is not aesthetic, it is functional. Lungs have room to work. Blood moves freely. Tension does not choke circulation. You feel how posture itself becomes medicine. In cramped cities, bodies fold inward. Shoulders collapse, breath shortens, fear becomes habitual. Here, the environment demands expansion. The sky does not allow hunching. The horizon invites the body to rise. Cold training appears again, quietly, not as endurance contests, not as rites of suffering, but as exposure woven into daily life. Cold water on skin, cold air on lungs, cold ground beneath feet. These are not extremes. They are consistent reminders that discomfort does not equal danger. You imagine what this does to the immune system even without naming it. The body learns flexibility. Vessels constrict and release. Heat is generated internally, not trapped artificially. When illness arrives, the system does not overreact. It has practiced responding without panic. Later myths will exaggerate this into claims that Tartarians were immune to cold, that they could survive freezing temperatures unscathed. You see now how that myth grows. From the outside, calm looks like invulnerability. Familiarity looks like immunity. You follow a small group into the early morning where movement replaces stillness before the body stiffens, gentle riding, stretching disguised as labour, lifting, bending, walking, never isolated as exercise, never postponed. Movement is not something scheduled here. It is life itself. You notice how rarely people sit for long without purpose. Illness exists, but it is deliberate. Rest, not stagnation. This balance matters. Muscles remain engaged but not strained. Circulation flows. Lymph moves. Waste is carried away from tissues quietly, efficiently. European visitors often mistook this constant low-level activity for restlessness. They longed for chairs, for long meals, for extended stillness. And when they sat too long, they felt worse. Their own bodies revealed the truth, but habit blinded them to it. Breath and movement intertwine. You watch how exertion never leads to gasping. Pace is managed instinctively. No one pushes to collapse. Endurance is built through consistency, not heroics. This is another detail that later storytellers will misunderstand. They will speak of superhuman stamina, of endless sears without fatigue. What they miss is pacing, the art of knowing when not to push. You think about how disease often strikes hardest when the body is already exhausted. Here, exhaustion is avoided not through indulgence, but through restraint. Energy is conserved, sleep is respected, recovery is woven into routine. The idea of resistance to disease takes on another shade now. It is not resistance as in battle. It is resistance as in yielding intelligently. The body bends rather than breaks. Stress passes through rather than lodging inside. You remember how missionaries wrote of Tartarians stepping from steam baths into cold air. That moment returns now, not as shock, but as ritualized contrast. Heat opens, cold closes. The body learns transition. Sudden change no longer triggers alarm. You realize how important this is. Disease often exploits systems that cannot adapt quickly. Contrast training, heat to cold, rest to movement, scarcity to nourishment, keeps the body alert without overwhelming it. Later generations will package this into techniques, systems, branded practices. But here it exists without a name. Children play in all conditions. They fall, they rise, they cry briefly, then move on. Minor injuries heal quickly, scratches are cleaned immediately, air and light are allowed to reach wounds. You see how infection struggles to gain ground when intervention is early and simple. You sense how outsiders watching this might assume some hidden physiological difference. But you see the training happening in real time, not imposed, not forced, encouraged by environment, reinforced by example. You think about modern life again, how comfort has become a shield that weakens rather than protects. Climate control removes challenge, convenience removes movement, entertainment removes stillness. And then, we are surprised when bodies fail under stress. Here, stress is familiar. Not constant, not extreme, but regular. And familiarity breeds competence. As the day unfolds, breathing remains steady. Even during exertion, even during laughter, even during cold. Panic does not hijack the lungs. And because panic does not lead, inflammation does not spiral. Illness does not find easy entry. You realize now why early explorers struggled to articulate this. Breath is invisible. Posture is subtle. Nervous system regulation had no language then, so what they saw they turned into myth. They wrote of strong chests and iron lungs. They speculated about bloodlines. They imagined biological differences because they lacked conceptual ones. But sitting here, breathing slowly, you feel how transferable this actually is not easily, not quickly, but possible, which makes it threatening to established narratives. You understand now that Tartarian resistance to disease was not something people possessed. It was something they practiced, every hour, every day, without calling it anything special. The wind shifts again. You inhale, slowly, deeply, almost unconsciously mirroring the rhythm around you. Your shoulders soften, your thoughts lengthen. The story itself begins to breathe with you. And as night approaches once more, you sense that another illusion has faded. The idea of immunity gives way to something quieter and more profound: adaptability. You rest with that word, letting it stretch gently through your awareness. Not invincibility, not superiority, just the humble, powerful ability to meet the world as it is and remain steady within it. You move onward, and the story narrows its focus, drawing you away from the wide sky and into quieter spaces where hands work close to the body. This is where the healers appear, not as robed mystics or secret masters, but as familiar figures whose presence blends into daily life so completely that outsiders often overlook them. These are the bone setters, the midwives, the herb keepers. They do not announce themselves. They are not separated from the rest of the people by titles or buildings. You realize that this, more than anything, is why they later became myth. Power that hides in plain sight is always mistaken for secrecy. You watch a healer at work. There is no drama. A twisted ankle is examined with calm hands, pressed gently, rotated slowly. The healer listens, not just to words, but to breath, to tension, to the way the body resists or yields. A wrap is applied, firm but not constricting. Movement is encouraged early, carefully. Stiffness is the enemy, not pain. European visitors often remarked on how quickly injuries healed here. They attributed it to strong constitutions, or unnatural resilience. You see the simpler truth? Injuries are addressed immediately. Rest is balanced with motion. Cold reduces swelling. Heat restores flow. The body is guided, not dominated. Midwives hold an essentially important place. Birth, you notice, is not isolated or medicalized. It is supported, attended, respected. Women move during labor. They breathe deeply. They squat, lean, shift positions. The body is responded to know what to do. Intervention comes only when necessary. This matters more than it seems. Generations born without trauma begin life with calmer nervous systems. Early stress shapes immunity. Gentle beginnings ripple outward into lifelong resilience. Later chroniclers never connected these dots. They counted survival rates without asking how survival was cultivated. Herb keepers appear again, quietly. They do not hoard knowledge. Children recognize plants by sight and smell. Bitter roots, calming leaves, warming seeds. Remedies are shared openly, not because they are trivial, but because they are ordinary. Knowledge here is not power, it is responsibility. You sense how foreign this felt to outsiders accustomed to guarded guilds and professional secrecy. If no one claims ownership of healing, then who holds authority? The answer unsettles hierarchical minds. Everyone, a little. Illness here is not outsourced entirely to specialists. People know when to rest, when to isolate, when to seek help. This shared literacy reduces delay. Disease rarely gets a head start. Prevention is communal, not centralized. European observers struggled to categorize this. They wanted priests, doctors, institutions. When they did not find them, they assumed something was hidden. And so the idea of secret healers was born, not because secrecy existed, but because familiarity looked like invisibility. You notice how healers avoid extremes. They do not bleed patients excessively. They do not purge without reason. They do not force cures. Their philosophy, though never written, seems guided by one principle: do no harm through excess. Balance again, restraint again. Later myths will claim Tartarian healers possessed lost techniques, advanced anatomy, forbidden knowledge. You understand why. Watching effective care delivered without spectacle feels unsettling. It threatens the idea that progress must look complex. You think about how modern medicine sometimes struggles with this too, how simple interventions are dismissed as insufficiently sophisticated. Yet here, simplicity is not ignorance. It is refinement through generations of observation. The healers also understand something rarely mentioned in old texts: timing. They act early. They do not wait for illness to announce itself loudly. Change in energy, appetite, sleep, these are enough. Early response prevents escalation. This alone could explain much of the so-called resistance to disease. You watch as a sick person is moved slightly away from others, not shunned, not feared, just given space, fresh air, warmth without crowding. The healer visits briefly, regularly, without drawing attention. Illness is integrated into life, not turned into spectacle. Outsiders often misread this calm as indifference. But you feel the care here deeply. It is quiet care, confident care, care that trusts the body's intelligence. You realize now how easily this system could collapse under pressure. War, famine, forced settlement. It depends on space, movement, time. When those disappear, advantages fade. And later historians, seeing Tartarians suffer illness like anyone else, will call the earlier accounts exaggerated or false. But both can be true. A way of life can confer resilience and still be fragile. As the healer steps back, the work done, there is no applause, no gratitude ritual. Healing is expected, not celebrated. Success leaves no monument. Failure is accepted without blame. You let that sink in. A system that works quietly leaves little evidence for history to record, and what history cannot see, it replaces with myth. As night approaches again, the healer returns to ordinary tasks. There is no separation between medicine and life. And in that seamlessness, you sense the heart of the Tartarian mystery. Not secret knowledge, not superior bodies, but a culture where care is continuous, shared, and unremarkable. You feel the story settling, becoming gentler, less sharp-edged. The conspiracy dissolves not into denial, but into something more intimate. A reminder that what protects us most often looks too simple to be believed. And with that understanding resting softly in your thoughts, you follow the fading light onward, knowing that the next layer of the myth will rise from fire and smoke, where meaning and sanitation blur into one. You drift forward again, and the air thickens with scent. Smoke curls upward in slow, deliberate ribbons, blurring the line between ritual and routine. This is where many later stories begin to tilt, where sanitation is mistaken for spirituality, and where ordinary practices acquire sacred weight simply because they work. You stand near a fire built not for warmth alone, but for cleansing. Juniper crackles softly, releasing a sharp, resinous fragrance that clears the nose and stings the eyes just enough to demand attention. Wormwood smoulders nearby, bitter and dry. These are not rare substances. They grow where people live. They are gathered casually, burned without ceremony, replenished when needed. European observers struggled here more than anywhere else. Smoke to them meant filth. It meant enclosed rooms, soot-blackened ceilings, coughing lungs. But this smoke behaves differently. It moves. It does not stagnate. Fires are built low, tended carefully, extinguished before choking the air. The smoke is a visitor, not a resident. You feel how insects avoid it, how moisture dries, how lingering odours vanish, how surfaces feel cleaner without being scrubbed. This is not magic. It is chemistry meeting habit. But chemistry unnamed easily becomes spirit. People pass briefly through these smoky spaces. They do not linger until dizzy. They know the edge. Afterwards, they step into open air, letting wind carry away what the smoke has loosened. Contrast again, heat and cool, exposure and release. Missionaries once wrote of these practices with unease. They used words like purification rites and spirit-cleansing fires. You sense how the misunderstanding took hold. When a practice has no explicit explanation, observers supply their own. And in a religious frame of mind, everything becomes symbolic. But watching closely, you see how pragmatic it is. Smoke is used after illness, after injury, after long travel, after births, after deaths. It is used when contamination is likely. It is avoided when not needed. This selectivity matters. Ritual would demand repetition regardless of the circumstance. Here, use follows context. You realize now how easily health practices become sacred simply because they protect life. Survival invites reverence, and reverence invites story. Some later accounts claim Tartarians believed smoke drove away evil spirits of disease. Perhaps some did. Belief often wraps around effectiveness like a story around a tool. But belief does not create the effect, it follows it. You think about how modern societies still do this. How we ritualize what works, then forget why it works, then argue about the ritual instead of the result. Fire appears again in daily life, not just as smoke but as heat. Tools are passed through flame, containers are warmed. Water is boiled without fuss. No one announces sterilization. It simply happens because fire is always present and always respected. Outsiders sometimes fail to notice this. They saw fires as primitive necessities, not as protective measures. They wrote of constant fires without connecting them to lower infection. The connection seemed too obvious, too uninteresting to record. And yet, here it is again. Disease didn't need an opportunity through repetition, not a revelation. You watch how the dead are handled. This is where stories often darken, where rumour thrives. Bodies are not kept long, they are not displayed. They are returned to earth quickly, with smoke and distance and care. There is respect, but not prolonged proximity. Grief does not override hygiene. European travellers sometimes misread this as the emotional coldness. You see now that it is emotional clarity. Love does not require endangerment. Memory does not require exposure. You feel how this would have reduced secondary illness after death, how many plagues spread through mourning rituals elsewhere. Here, grief is private, contained, allowed space without crowding. The firelight softens as evening deepens. Shadows stretch, smoke thins, children move through it without fear, used to its presence, knowing instinctively when to step back. This familiarity matters. Fear of smoke causes panic breathing. Calm allows benefit without harm. You notice how rarely anyone coughs in these smoky spaces. Another contradiction to outsider expectation. Because the smoke is brief, controlled, and followed by fresh air, lungs are challenged but not overwhelmed. Again, training rather than assault. You remember how earlier myths spoke of Tartarian sacred fires and energy-cleansing rituals? You see how easily this emerges. When sanitation lacks a vocabulary, symbolism fills the gap. But here, symbolism is secondary. The primary language is the body's response. Clear sinuses, fewer infections, faster recovery. You think about how modern science eventually rediscovered these principles. Antiseptics, sterilization, ventilation. How smoke was replaced by chemicals, how fire gave way to stainless steel and autoclaves. And yet for centuries the absence of these concepts was filled by belief rather than understanding. The Tartarian approach did not wait for theory, it acted on observation. If something reduced sickness, it was repeated. If it caused harm, it was adjusted or abandoned. No ideology defended ineffective practice. You sense how this flexible pragmatism resists codification. It does not lend itself to rigid doctrine. And what cannot be codified cannot be easily transmitted across cultures. So it becomes misunderstood, exoticized, mythologized. Some later conspiracy theories will claim that Tartarian fire rituals harnessed energy unknown to modern science. You understand the temptation of that idea. It preserves wonder, it implies loss. But standing here, you feel the wonder is already present, in the simplicity, in the attention, in the refusal to separate daily life from care. You notice how fire is never left unattended. Respect again. Control again. Nothing here is left to chance if it can be guided gently. As night settles, the last embers glow softly. Smoke becomes memory. The air clears. People sleep without the heavy, stale atmosphere that plagues enclosed dwellings elsewhere. Lungs rest, immune systems repair. Another invisible benefit. Another unrecorded success. You let your thoughts slow with the fading light. The fire has told its part of the story. Not as symbol, not as mystery, but as tool elevated by care. And you realize now how the idea of Tartarian resistance to disease grew not from a single secret, but from 1,000 small practices misunderstood by those who looked for drama instead of pattern. As you move onward, the smoke dissolves behind you, leaving only a quiet clarity in its wake. The next part of the journey will take you into built space, cities imagined as clean or cursed, and you carry with you the understanding that even stone and structure can either invite sickness or quietly turn it away. You move onward, and the open plain slowly reshapes itself into something denser. The horizon tightens. Stone and timber rise where grass once ruled. This is where the story grows complicated, where later generations stumble most often, because cities, more than anything else, invite judgment. You enter the cities attributed to Tartaria, not as they were drawn in later engravings, gleaming domes, impossible symmetry, but as they likely existed in life, practical, breathable, unfinished. Not monuments to permanence, but shelters that expected change. European chroniclers disagreed fiercely about these places. Some called them marvels of order, others dismissed them as crude. What united their confusion was one unsettling observation. These cities did not behave like European cities. Illness did not spread the same way. Crowding did not feel inevitable. Filth did not accumulate where one expected it to. You walk the streets slowly. They are wider than you imagined, not because of grandeur, but because space is valued. Air moves freely. Sunlight reaches the ground. There are few deep shadows where dampness lingers. Buildings are spaced deliberately, not pressed together in competition. You feel how this alone would change everything. In European cities, density was destiny. Narrow alleys trapped a breath, waste, moisture. Disease travelled easily, invisibly, turning proximity into peril. Here, proximity exists, but with pauses, with gaps, with release. You notice drainage first. Water does not linger. Snowmelt is guided away. Waste flows outward, not inward. This is not engineering brilliance in the modern sense. It is observation repeated over generations. Where water sits, sickness follows. So water is encouraged to move on. Bathing spaces appear often, but they are not luxurious. Steam rooms, simple pools, heated stones. Cleanliness is woven into routine rather than reserved for special occasions. You recall how missionaries once compared these spaces to Roman baths, then dismissed the thought. They could not reconcile simplicity with effectiveness. You realize now how cities like this would have appeared almost unfinished to outsiders, too open, too exposed, too unwilling to seal themselves from the environment. But sealing, you know now, is often the beginning of stagnation. Markets are active but transient. Goods arrive, are exchanged, then leave. Nothing piles up for long. Food spoils rarely because it does not wait. Waste is removed quickly because space allows it. The city breathes like a living organism, expanding and contracting through the day. You sense how later storytellers would struggle with this. Cities that do not aim for permanence leave fewer ruins, fewer monuments, less evidence, and absence invites speculation. If cities leave little trace, perhaps they were destroyed, erased, hidden. But what if they simply did not cling to stone the way others did? You think about how Tartarian cities are often described as clean or cursed. Clean because illness seemed absent. Cursed because such absence threatened accepted beliefs. If cities could exist without constant plague, then plague was not a necessary tax of civilization. That idea unsettled Europe deeply. You notice how animals are kept at the margins, not interwoven with living quarters. You notice how refuse is handled quietly, routinely. You notice how people move through streets without pressing against one another. These are not dramatic features. They do not inspire awe, but they deny disease the intimacy it requires. European visitors sometimes accuse these cities of lacking soul, lacking density, lacking vibrancy. They equated noise and crowding with life. Here, life expresses itself through flow, not congestion. You feel how such cities would frustrate later historians. They do not fit the story of linear progress. They do not build upward endlessly. They do not fortify themselves obsessively. They are comfortable with impermanence. And impermanence, again, resists myth. Some conspiracy narratives will claim these cities were powered by lost energy technologies, that domes regulated frequency, that architecture itself healed bodies. Standing here, you understand how these ideas arise. When health improves in a place, people search for a single cause. They prefer marvel to mundane. But you see the pattern now: space, air, water, movement, routine. These are the real architects. You remember the caravans, the camps, the fires. The cities simply scale those principles without abandoning them. They are camps that linger longer, but never long enough to forget why movement matters. You watch people enter and leave the city easily. There is no obsession with sealing borders against illness. Instead, health is maintained internally. When sickness appears, response is quick and localized. Quarantine happens naturally through space and habit, not through fear. This explains something that puzzled chroniclers for centuries: why Tartarian cities did not record mass burial grounds during the Great Plague years. It was not that death never came, it was that it did not arrive in waves. Waves require density, they require stagnation, they require panic. You feel how this understanding changes the tone of the story. Tartarian resistance to disease is no longer a mystery locked in bodies or blood. It is a feature of design informed by humility toward nature rather than domination of it. As night falls, lanterns glow softly. Smoke drifts lightly, then dissipates. The air remains clear. People sleep without sealing themselves into stone boxes. Breath continues its quiet work. You stand at the edge of the city and look back. It does not impress you with grandeur, it comforts you with balance. And balance, you realize, rarely survives conquest, forced settlement, or the pressure to appear advanced. Later ages will redraw these cities as wonders beyond explanation. They will fill gaps with technology and loss, but you have walked their streets now and you know the truth is gentler. Health here is not enforced, it is allowed. And as you move onward, leaving stone behind for open ground once more, you carry with you a growing certainty that the greatest threat to Tartarian health was never disease itself, but the slow erosion of the very principles that made such cities possible. You move forward, again, and the city loosens its grip behind you. Stone gives way to space, walls dissolve into distance. This is where another quiet truth waits, one so simple it was often mistaken for cruelty, and so effective it was later described as something inhuman. This is where quarantine lives, not as law, but as instinct. You watch it unfold without announcement. A cough lingers too long, a fever dulls the eyes, nothing dramatic happens, no bells, no guards, no proclamations. The person simply moves, slightly farther from others, slightly downwind, slightly apart. Space opens like water parting around a stone. You feel how different this is from fear-based isolation. There is no stigma here, no shame. Distance is not punishment, it is care. European observers struggle to understand this most of all. In their world, separation meant abandonment. Hospitals meant clustering the sick together, concentrating illness until it multiplied. Here, the logic is reversed. Illness is diluted, not contained. You see how the open plain makes this possible. Camps are flexible, shelters can be rearranged, movement is easy, the land itself cooperates. Quarantine here does not require force because it does not require permanence. You realize something important now. Quarantine in Tartarian life is not about stopping movement, it is about redirecting it. The sick are not locked away. They are given access to air, light, rest. Visitors come but briefly, carefully. Food arrives without crowding, care continues without intimacy. This subtle balance, connection without closeness, is rarely achieved elsewhere. You watch how quickly this response happens, not after illness explodes, but at the first hint. A change in breath, a heaviness in step. Early signals are trusted. No one demands proof. Waiting for certainty is considered dangerous. Later myths will say Tartarians did not fear disease. You see now that this is untrue. They respected it. And respect, unlike fear, leads to clear action. You notice how travel itself functions as a protective layer. Caravans do not move as dense masses. They stretch out. Camps are staggered. Routes are adjusted seasonally. When sickness is rumoured ahead, paths shift quietly. No panic spreads because information does not become spectacle. Distance again. Always distance. European chroniclers sometimes accuse Tartarians of being emotionally cold because they did not gather tightly around the sick. You feel the misunderstanding immediately. What looks like coldness is restraint. What looks like detachment or permanence is foresight. You think about how grief behaves differently here too. When someone dies, mourning does not involve mass gathering. Memory is honoured privately, the dead are returned to earth quickly. Life continues without crowding around loss. This prevents secondary waves of illness that often follow tragedy elsewhere. You realise how shocking this must have been to outsiders raised on communal suffering, on shared pain as proof of love. Here, love chooses survival. The open plain itself enforces honesty. There is nowhere to hide decay. Waste is visible. Mistakes are obvious. If a camp lingers too long, sickness appears. When that happens, people move sooner next time. Learning is immediate. Feedback is swift. In cities, feedback is delayed. Walls hide consequences. Disease spreads invisibly until it overwhelms. Here, cause and effect are close enough to touch. You watch children learn this instinctively. They are taught to give space without cruelty, to observe without hovering, to help without crowding. These lessons are never formalized. They are absorbed. You imagine how difficult it would be to impose this logic on a dense, stratified society. Space is privilege there. Here it is shared necessity. Later historians, uncomfortable with this simplicity, will claim Tartarians possessed advanced quarantine knowledge, secret epidemiology, even non-human foresight. You understand the impulse. It preserves mystery. It avoids admitting that many societies chose density over health for reasons of power, control and symbolism. You think again of resistance to disease. It appears here not as immunity, but as timing. Early distance prevents exponential spread. The math of illness never gets the chance to accelerate. You feel how modern concepts echo this. Flattening curves, reducing contact, but stripped of space and habit, they require enforcement. Here, they require only memory. As evening approaches, you watch a small camp adjust itself. Tents shift. Fires move. Nothing dramatic, nothing recorded. And yet, this quiet reconfiguration prevents tomorrow's illness. You sense now how deeply this challenges the myth of Tartarian erasure. A culture that leaves few fixed structures, few mass graves, few written laws is easy to misunderstand. When it fades under pressure, war, forced settlement, enclosure, it leaves behind rumours rather than ruins. And rumours grow teeth. You pause and breathe, feeling the openness around you. You understand now why the idea of Tartarians being inhumanly resistant took hold. From the outside, their calm looks unnatural, their restraint looks cold, their survival looks like magic. But standing here, you feel the humanity in it deeply. Care expressed through space, love expressed through distance, community preserved by refusing to cluster around danger. This is not denial of disease, it is acceptance of reality. As night falls once more, the camps settle into their new shapes. Breath moves freely, wind carries away what does not belong. Illness, if present, remains contained by habit rather than force. You let this understanding soften you. Resistance, you see now, is not about fighting harder, it is about stepping back sooner. And with that quiet truth resting beside you, you continue onward, knowing that the next part of the story will lead you into the most haunting absence of all, the missing graves that history expected to find and could not. You move onward, and the air grows heavier, not with sickness, but with expectation. This is where the story pauses over an absence so loud it unsettled generations of historians. This is where you are led, gently but insistently, to search for something that should be there. The plague years. You feel their weight before you see them. In Europe, these years are marked by numbers carved into memory. Millions lost, cities emptied, bells ringing without rest, graves piled upon graves, records thick with death. History here is loud, undeniable, overwhelming, and so you are invited to ask a simple question. Where are the Tartarian dead? You walk through regions that later scholars expected to find mass burial grounds, plague pits, fields of bones. They comb the soil, they read maps, they compare timelines. Epidemics sweep across continents, and then hesitate, thin, or fragment as they approach these spaces, not vanish, not stop entirely, but fail to leave the scars history is trained to look for. This absence becomes suspicious. Some historians dismiss it outright. They argue records were lost, that soil swallowed evidence, that nomadic peoples leave little trace. All of this may be true, but others pause. They notice that even settled Tartarian cities, those briefly described, later abandoned, lack the signature wounds of plague Europe knew so well. You feel the tension here. Absence is dangerous. It invites imagination. It demands explanation. An explanation, when evidence is thin, becomes fertile ground for myth. Later narratives will leap quickly to extremes. They will say Tartarians were immune, that disease could not touch them, that their bodies were different. Or worse, that the evidence was deliberately erased, that mass graves were hidden, that history itself was edited to conceal an impossible truth. You sit with these ideas without rejecting them outright, you let them breathe, but you also remember what you have already seen, the spacing, the movement, the early response, the dilution of illness before it could swell into catastrophe. Mass graves appear when disease outpaces response, when fear delays action, when density amplifies spread, when death arrives faster than burial. You ask yourself quietly, what if Tartaria simply never allowed death to arrive in that way? You imagine illness appearing in a camp. A few cases, the camp shifts, the sick are spaced. Travel pauses or redirects. The outbreak burns itself out quietly, a handful die. They are buried quickly, individually, without ceremony that gathers crowds. The land absorbs them without record. No waves, no piles, no shock. History, trained to notice spectacle, misses it entirely. You think about how modern disasters are remembered. Numbers make memory stick. Without numbers, events dissolve. Without monuments, absence feels like denial. And yet, how many lives have been lived and ended without trace? How many quiet deaths never demanded a chronicler's attention? European historians expected Tartaria to mirror Europe. When it did not, they assumed something unnatural had occurred. Either Tartarians were extraordinary, or history had been manipulated. You feel the allure of manipulation narratives. They give purpose to confusion. They imply intent where there may have been none. They comfort by suggesting that truth still exists somewhere, hidden, waiting to be uncovered. But you also sense the quieter possibility, that the way Tartarians lived simply did not produce the kind of evidence later ages were trained to find. Nomadic burials leave little behind. Temporary settlements erase themselves. Even cities designed for impermanence fade gently back into earth. Without stone vaults and dense cemeteries, death leaves fewer signatures. You pause over a troubling detail. Some explorers did note deaths. They wrote of sickness, of loss, or of hardship during famine and the war. These accounts exist. They are just scattered, unsensational, easily overlooked. They do not align with the image of invulnerability. They align with humanity. So why do people insist on immunity? Because it explains the absence neatly. Because it feels proportional to the mystery. Because quiet competence does not satisfy the hunger for meaning. You feel how this connects to modern thinking. When data is incomplete, imagination fills the gap. When outcomes differ, essence is blamed. They are different, we say, rather than they lived differently. You walk through imagined fields where plague pits were expected but never found. Grass waves gently, wind passes over soil undisturbed by mass burial. You feel how eerie this must have felt to those searching centuries later. How unsettling to find nothing where horror was expected. But emptiness does not always mean erasure. Sometimes it means prevention worked. You think about how modern public health success often looks like nothing happening. No crisis, no spectacle, just absence of disaster. And how quickly such success is forgotten, doubted, or reinterpreted as exaggeration. The Tartarian story suffers the same fate. Their success, if that is what it was, left no monument. And without monuments, memory becomes rumour. You feel the story slowing here, growing heavier. This is a hinge point. From here, the narrative can tilt toward wonder or toward understanding. Later sections will explore how this absence fueled ideas of non-human ancestry, hidden technology, engineered immunity. Those ideas bloom in this silence. But for now, you remain here, standing in the quiet where graves were expected but never demanded. You let the silence speak for itself, not as proof of invincibility, but as evidence that sometimes the most effective systems leave behind the least drama. As night settles again, you imagine the land long after the camps have moved on. Grass regrows, wind erases footprints. The earth keeps its secrets not because they are forbidden, but because they were never carved into stone. You breathe slowly, feeling the weight of this realization ease rather than tighten. Absence does not always mean deception. Sometimes it means something worked too quietly to be remembered. And with that thought drifting softly beside you, you continue onward, knowing the next step in the journey will carry you into the realm where silence becomes speculation, where bodies, bloodlines, and the hunger to believe in something more than human begin to shape the legend anew. You move onward, and the quiet absence you just passed through begins to fill again, not with evidence but with imagination. This is where the story tilts, where silence becomes invitation, and where the human mind, uncomfortable with gaps, reaches for something extraordinary to place inside them. This is where bodies themselves become the mystery. You hear the language change almost immediately. No longer habits, no longer cities or camps. Now the words circle around blood, ancestry, origin. They were different, later writers insist, built differently. Not entirely like us. And you feel the familiar chill that comes when explanation slips into separation. The idea emerges slowly, then gathers force. Perhaps Tartarians resisted disease not because of how they lived, but because of what they were. You sit with this idea carefully, As one would with a fragile object, you do not dismiss it. Dismiss. You examine it from all sides. European explorers often describe Tartarian bodies with a mixture of awe and discomfort. Broad chests, enduring lungs, skin that weathered cold and sun without breaking, recovery that seemed too quick. Children who survived conditions that would weaken others. These observations were real, but interpretation crept in quietly like fog. Instead of asking how such bodies were shaped, many asked where they came from. Bloodlines become the answer of last resort when culture feels threatening. If difference is innate, then it is safe. It cannot be learned. It cannot spread. It cannot challenge the order of things. You notice how quickly physical resilience is conflated with moral or metaphysical difference. Strong bodies become signs of ancient ancestry. Calm responses to illness to become signs of emotional detachment, or worse, lack of soul. From there, it is only a short step to speculation about non-human origins. You hear the whispers, descendants of giants, remnants of a lost race, hybrids of earth and sky. Later centuries will dress these ideas in new language. Engineered beings, altered DNA, ancient interventions, but the shape of the thought remains the same. If they were immune, they must not have been fully human. You feel the danger in this reasoning. You have seen it before in many forms across history. When one group appears healthier, stronger, more resilient, the explanation often shifts away from systems and toward essence. It protects those in power from self-examination, but you also understand the appeal. Bodies are tangible, blood feels concrete, habit is slippery, environment is invisible. It is easier to imagine a hidden lineage than to admit that entire civilizations might have organized themselves poorly for health. You recall how the Jesuits struggled with this. They searched for spiritual explanations and found none that fit neatly. They observed no exceptional piety, no obvious divine favoritism, and so biology becomes the next container for mystery. Later writers will cherry-pick descriptions. They will emphasize height, strength, and endurance while ignoring variability. They will ignore the sick, the injured, the weak, because those do not serve the story of exception. You pause here and imagine a Tartarian elder, bent with age, breathing slowly by the fire. Not immune, not extraordinary, just human. Such images rarely survive in legend. Legends prefer the young, the strong, the unbreakable. You think about how bodies adapt across generations without changing what they are. Cold exposure thickens capillaries. Endurance expands lungs. Diet shapes metabolism. Stress, or its absence, shapes immunity. None of this requires a new species. It requires time, but time is exactly what later narratives refuse to grant. They want shortcuts. They want causes that are dramatic and final. They want answers that do not ask anything of the present. So bloodlines are invoked. You feel the story darken slightly here, because once bodies are declared different, everything else follows. Erasure becomes easier. Conquest feels justified. They were not like us anyway. Even admiration carries a blade. Some modern conspiracy theories push this further. They suggest Tartarians were engineered beings designed for resilience, that ancient powers manipulated human biology, that immunity was built in, not learned. These ideas feel thrilling. They give cosmic significance to what was otherwise mundane. But you notice something telling. These theories rarely explain why such beings would abandon the very habits that sustained them. Why, if immunity was innate, disease later devastated their populations just like any others. Why famine, war, and forced settlement broke them so thoroughly. Biology alone cannot explain collapse. You recall what you have already seen. When movement stopped, sickness rose. When space closed, outbreaks intensified. When routine broke, resilience faded. These are not signs of lost DNA. They are signs of lost systems. You realize now that the myth of special blood is born at the exact moment those systems disappear. When Tartarian ways of living are dismantled, through enclosure, conquest, urbanization, health outcomes change. Observers, noticing the decline, assume the original resilience must have been something else, something internal, something that could be lost or diluted. Thus, the story of bloodlines conveniently explains both rise and fall. You think about how often modern people do the same. When a culture thrives, we attribute it to genius. When it falls, we attribute it to corruption. Rarely do we examine structure. You feel a gentle sadness here. because attributing Tartarian health to non-human origins robs them of their humanity. It turns lived wisdom into accident. It transforms care into anomaly. And yet, you do not judge those who believe it. Belief grows where clarity is denied, and history denied Tartaria clarity by preserving fragments instead of wholes. You remember the missing graves, the quiet cities, the understated healers. All of it contributes to an impression of something unreal, too neat, too clean, too absent, so bodies become the last available canvas. But you feel your own body as you breathe now. You feel how posture changes breath, how calm changes sensation. You feel how adaptable you are even now. And you know, quietly, that humans do not need to be redesigned to be resilient. They need space, rhythm, restraint, and care. The Tartarians, whatever else they were human enough to suffer when those were taken away. As the night deepens, the speculation begins to loosen its grip. You feel it soften, become less urgent. The idea of non-human ancestry loses some of its shine when weighed against the quiet evidence of daily life. You are left with a more uncomfortable, but more honest thought. What if Tartarian resistance to disease was not proof that they were different from us, but proof of what humans can be when life is arranged with humility toward the body? You let that question settle without answering it. This story is not here to convince you. It is here to walk with you through the layers, to feel where wonder ends and responsibility begins. And as you continue onward, you know the next layer will carry you even deeper into evacuation, into stories of metals, machines, frequencies, and healing technologies, ideas that bloom when human effort feels too small to explain what once worked so well. You move onward, and the ground beneath the story begins to shimmer. What was once habit and body now becomes object and mechanism. This is where metal enters the legend, where the human scale feels insufficient, and where imagination reaches for tools that hum, resonate, and promise mastery. This is the realm of sky metal, magnets, and healing machines. You feel the shift immediately. The language grows sharper, more technical, yet oddly more vague. Words like copper, frequency, resonance, energy begin to appear, terms that sound precise but float without anchor. Later storytellers insist that Tartarians possessed technologies lost to time, devices that regulated health itself, making disease irrelevant. You sit with this idea carefully. As before, copper appears first. Chroniclers noted its frequent use in vessels, in adornment, in tools. Later writers leap from this to speculation. Copper conducts, copper influences fields, copper must have been intentional, they say, part of a healing network embedded into daily life. You touch a copper bowl in your mind. It is warm, slightly reactive, alive in the hand. You remember that copper kills microbes, that water stored in it spoils more slowly. These facts are now well known, but once they were not named, and unnamed effectiveness again becomes mystery. What was practical becomes technological legend. Magnets follow quickly. Tartaria, stretched across regions rich in iron and magnetic stone, becomes fertile ground for speculation. People claim that buildings were aligned to Earth's fields, that sleeping positions mattered, that energy flowed invisibly through cities, protecting inhabitants from sickness. You pause and breathe. You remember the wide streets, the airflow, the spacing, the sunlight. You ask yourself gently, do we need unseen machines when visible design already explains so much? But the mind wants more. It wants devices because devices imply control. They imply lost mastery rather than lost restraint. They shift responsibility away from daily life and into ancient genius. You notice how often these technological myths emerge alongside a sense of grief. If Tartarians had machines that healed them, and those machines are gone, then our suffering feels imposed rather than chosen. We become victims of loss rather than participants in neglect. The idea is comforting. Some stories describe domes that resonated at healing frequencies, towers that broadcast energy, floors that vibrated gently to stimulate blood flow. You understand why these images are seductive. They echo modern technologies, radio waves, ultrasound, electromagnetism, projected backward in time. But you also notice something crucial. None of these stories explain why such technology would vanish completely, leaving no trace, no continuity, no gradual decay into simpler forms. Technology does not disappear overnight. It degrades, adapts, repurposes itself. What did disappear quickly were ways of living. You think about how copper bowls became stainless steel, how open courtyards became sealed rooms, how fire became hidden behind walls, how wind was excluded in the name of comfort. These changes feel mundane. They do not inspire conspiracy, but they explain a great deal. You watch someone place water in a copper vessel again. The water rests, settles, becomes calmer somehow. Is it frequency or is it chemistry and time? Does the distinction matter if the result is the same? Perhaps this is the quiet truth behind many technological myths. They are attempts to preserve effect when cause has been forgotten. They are stories told by people who sense something worked once but no longer understand how. You think about modern wellness culture, how it wraps ancient habits in technological language, biohacking, optimization, frequencies, because habit alone feels too humble, too slow, too human. Tartaria becomes a mirror again. Some theories insist that Tartarian technology was deliberately destroyed, hidden by conquering powers who feared its implications. You acknowledge this possibility without embracing it fully. History has erased many things, but erasure does not require conspiracy when neglect is sufficient. When people stop living a certain way, the tools that supported that way of life lose meaning. They are discarded, melted down, reused. Copper bowls become coins, domes become ruins, purpose dissolves quietly. You sense how much gentler this explanation is and how much less satisfying it feels to those who want grandeur. You recall the healers who needed no machines, the quarantine that required no enforcement, the cities that breathed without engines. These are not signs of technological deficiency. They are signs of technological humility. Perhaps Tartarian health did not rely on machines because machines were unnecessary. You feel the story exhale here. The shimmering speculation begins to settle. The metal cools. The imagined hum fades. What remains is something less cinematic but more enduring. You realize now that technological myths often bloom where continuity is broken. When people inherit fragments without context, they invent scaffolding to hold them together. Frequencies become bridges, energy becomes glue, but standing here in the quiet after the hum fades, you feel that the real technology was always the same one humans have carried everywhere. The ability to observe, adapt, and repeat what works. The night deepens. The idea of lost machines softens into the background. It does not vanish entirely, it never does, but it loses its urgency. And as you continue onward, you sense that the next layer of the story will darken again, not with speculation, but with accusation. Stories of forbidden books, erased remedies, and deliberate forgetting will rise next, fed by the same hunger that sought machines where habits once lived. You carry the calm with you, knowing that not every lost effect requires a lost device to explain it. You move onward, and the shimmer of metal and imagined machines dims behind you. In its place rises a darker mood, heavier, slower. This is where curiosity hardens into suspicion, where wonder turns into accusation. The story begins to speak of loss not as accident, but as int. This is where forbidden books appear. You feel them before you see them. Libraries half-remembered, scrolls burned, remedies whispered about but never written down. Later voices insist that Tartarian knowledge of health was not merely forgotten, but deliberately erased. That cures were hidden, that methods were banned, that what once protected millions was stolen from history itself. You let the claim settle without rejecting it outright. History has burned many books. Knowledge has been suppressed before. The idea is not absurd, but you have learned to listen carefully now to separate grief from evidence, longing from fact. You imagine a healer's notebook never meant to survive centuries. A list of herbs, notes on timing, observations passed orally, corrected by experience, refined by memory rather than ink. Such knowledge does not survive conquest well. It does not translate easily into foreign systems. It depends on context. When context collapses, knowledge evaporates. You see how this could feel like erasure from the outside. European systems favoured written authority, centralised doctrine, formal instruction. Tartarian health practices favoured repetition, imitation, lived memory. When one system overran the other, the quieter one left fewer traces. Silence begins to look like censorship. Later generations, discovering fragments, references to herbs without recipes, to baths without schematics, assume something is missing. They imagine locked archives, forbidden shelves, deliberate concealment. The story grows teeth here. Someone must be responsible. You feel the comfort this provides. If suffering exists today, it must be because something was taken away. Blame becomes a salve. But you also notice something else. Suppression stories often appear when practices require effort rather than belief. It is easier to imagine that cures were hidden than to accept that they demanded daily discipline most people would not maintain. You recall the habits you have already seen. Cold water, smoke, movement, space, restraint. None of these require secrecy to vanish. They vanish naturally when comfort, convenience, and density take their place. No burning is required, only forgetting. You think about how oral knowledge fades, when elders die during famine or war, when children are separated from teachers, when rhythms are broken, the chain snaps quietly without villain or decree. Later writers, encountering this gap, mistake fragility for conspiracy. Some insist that Tartarian remedies threatened emerging medical authorities and so were banned. You acknowledge the possibility, but you also see the difficulty. Remedies that rely on environment and habit are hard to patent, hard to monetize, hard to control. They are less threatening than irrelevant. Systems do not usually suppress what they can safely ignore. You picture a conqueror arriving in Tartarian lands. He brings laws, taxes, walls, fixed settlements. He brings new diets, new schedules, new priorities. Health outcomes change, disease increases. The conqueror does not need to ban old practices. He replaces the conditions that made them possible. From the inside, this feels like loss. From the outside, it looks like progress. You feel how deeply unsettling this is. It suggests that no villain is required, only momentum. And yet the idea of forbidden books persists because it gives shape to grief. It transforms diffuse loss into a story with edges. You sit with that grief now, not dismissing it, not indulging it, simply acknowledging it. Perhaps some texts were burned. Perhaps some remedies were hidden or dismissed. History is not gentle, but perhaps the greater loss was quieter, the loss of patience, of space, of willingness to live slightly uncomfortably for long-term resilience. Those things are always the first to go. You remember how the missionaries wrote with frustration about habits they found unpleasant. Smoke that stung, cold that shocked, simplicity that bored. Such practices do not survive cultures that equate comfort with advancement. So when later generations search archives for Tartarian cures and find nothing, they imagine locks and seals, they imagine guardians, they imagine power. What they rarely imagine is boredom. Boring knowledge is the easiest to lose. You feel the story slowing again, heavy with this realization. Erasure does not always roar. Sometimes it whispers, sometimes it yawns, sometimes it simply stops being practiced because it does not fit a new rhythm of life. As night deepens, the image of burning books fades. In its place remains something quieter, a gap where lived knowledge once flowed. You realize now that Tartarian resistance to disease did not vanish because it was forbidden. It vanished because it was inconvenient, and that truth, more than any conspiracy, is the hardest to accept. You breathe slowly, letting the weight lift slightly. The story has passed through accusation and returned to something more human. Ahead, the journey will turn again, toward needles, inoculation, and early encounters between Eastern practices and Western fear. And you move forward carrying this understanding gently, knowing that what was lost may not be locked away, but waiting quietly for attention once more. You move onward, and the mood shifts again, not darker this time, but sharper, tinged with unease. The quiet habits you have followed now brush against something more pointed, something that settled observers deeply because it looked uncomfortably familiar. This is where needles appear, not the polished instruments of modern medicine, but small deliberate punctures, scratches, cuts made with intention, powder rubbed into skin. You feel the tension rise immediately because here the line between practice and prophecy becomes thin. European travellers occasionally noted something strange in the East. They wrote of people who seemed to invite illness in a controlled way, who exposed themselves deliberately to mild forms of disease. The descriptions were vague, cautious, almost embarrassed. They did not yet have language for what they were witnessing. You recognize it now as early inoculation. Smallpox terrified Europe. It arrived without mercy, scarred faces, emptied families. And yet, scattered reports suggest that in parts of Tartarian lands and nearby regions, smallpox did not behave with the same ferocity. It appeared, but it did not always devastate. This disturbed observers more than outright immunity would have. You imagine a healer preparing a small amount of material from a mild case. Not ceremonially, not recklessly, carefully, a shallow cut, a brief fever, then recovery. No applause, no announcement, just another quiet intervention. You feel how radical this must have seemed. To willingly risk illness in order to avoid catastrophe violates instinct. Fear demands avoidance. Wisdom sometimes demands approach. European doctors would later rediscover this practice and call it revolutionary. But here, it appears as one more example of early response, meeting danger when it is small rather than waiting until it becomes overwhelming. You notice how consistent this is with everything you have seen. Tartarian habits do not aim for zero risk. They aim for manageable risk. Cold exposure. Bitter foods, smoke, movement, a hunt. And now, controlled exposure to disease itself. This is not superstition, it is pattern recognition. Yet to outsiders, it looks terrifying, dangerous, heretical. Some missionaries recorded it with alarm, suggesting it interfered with divine will. Others dismissed it as reckless folklore. Very few tried to understand it fully. You feel how easily this practice could slide into myth. Later storytellers would exaggerate it into claims that Tartarians had mastered immunity itself, that they engineered resistance through secret rites. The truth is simpler and harder. They accepted that illness was inevitable, and they refused to let inevitability turn into helplessness. You think about how inoculation challenges authority. It places power in hands outside formal institutions. It requires trust in local knowledge. It undermines the idea that salvation must come from above, whether from church or crown. Perhaps this is why the practice travelled so slowly westward. Not because it was unknown, but because it was uncomfortable. It forced societies to rethink fear, control, and responsibility. You imagine the moment when such practices met European cities, crowded, stratified, afraid. A method that requires careful timing, space, and observation would struggle to survive there. Done improperly, it could be disastrous, and so it was often rejected outright rather than adapted carefully. Rejection breeds myth. When Europeans later adopted inoculation, they framed it as a discovery, not a borrowing. They stripped it of context and ritual, turning it into procedure. The Tartarian connection faded, credit shifted, memory blurred. You feel the quiet injustice of that, not as outrage but as sadness. Knowledge travels strangely. It sheds its origins when it crosses borders. You also feel how easily inoculation narratives feed conspiracy today. The idea that ancient peoples knew something modern society lost feels validating. It suggests decline rather than complexity, but standing here you see continuity instead. The Tartarian approach was never about defeating disease entirely, it was about negotiating with it, reducing its impact, preventing collapse. You think about how modern medicine often frames itself as war, battles, enemies, eradication. The Tartarian rhythm feels different. It is more like conversation, exposure followed by rest, challenge followed by recovery. As night deepens, you imagine a child sleeping after a mild fever, watched carefully, breathing steadily. Tomorrow the danger will have passed. The community will be safer. No monument will mark this moment. No record will celebrate it. And centuries later, historians will wonder why disaster never came in waves here. You feel the pattern now. Early action, small doses, gentle challenges. Repeated often enough, they create resilience that looks like immunity to those who arrive too late to see the process. You breathe slowly, letting this understanding settle. Tartarian resistance to disease was not avoidance. It was engagement without panic. And as you continue onward, you sense the story nearing its turning point. What happens when this way of life is placed under extreme stress? War, famine, forced settlement. What happens when gentle systems meet violent change? The answer waits ahead, where resistance falters and legend reshapes itself around collapse. You move onward, and the air changes again. Not with speculation this time, but with strain. The rhythm you have followed so carefully begins to falter. Habits that once flowed effortlessly now meet resistance. This is where the story tightens, where the idea of Tartarian resistance to disease is tested not by theory but by pressure. This is where stress enters the body of the civilization itself. You feel it first as crowding. Camps that once moved freely begin to linger. Routes are interrupted. Borders harden. War pushes people closer together than they would ever choose. Refuge replaces rhythm. Suddenly distance becomes a luxury instead of a habit. You notice how quickly things change. Food becomes scarce or irregular. Fermentation is rushed or abandoned. Broths thin. Bitter herbs are harder to find when land is contested or overused. The steady nourishment that once supported resilience weakens quietly, without announcement. You watch how sleep shortens. Fires burn longer into the night. Anxiety stretches waking hours. Rest becomes shallow. The body, once repaired nightly, now carries yesterday's strain into tomorrow. You feel the shift in breath. It tightens. Panic begins to whisper where calm once lived. The nervous system, trained for adaptation, now faces sustained threat. And sustained threat changes everything. Disease notices. You see outbreaks begin to behave differently now. Where once they flickered and faded, they start to linger. Quarantine still happens, but space is harder to create. Movement is restricted. People cluster not out of ignorance, but out of necessity. Care becomes harder to deliver early. You realize something important here. Tartarian resistance to disease was never absolute. It depended on conditions, and conditions are fragile. Later historians often ignore this period. It complicates the myth. If Tartarians were immune, how could sickness return? So this era is either minimized or reframed as proof that the original resilience must have been something else, something biological that was lost or diluted. But you see the truth unfolding in front of you. Systems break under stress long before bodies do. You watch forced settlement change everything. Nomads are told to stay. Cities are reorganized. Density increases. Waste accumulates. Air stops moving freely. Fires are regulated or removed. Smoke disappears, not replaced by cleanliness, but by enclosure. What once protected now becomes impossible. You feel the tragedy of this, not as outrage, but as inevitability. A way of life finely tuned to openness cannot survive being sealed. Illness arrives not because Tartarians have become weaker, but because their environment has become hostile to the very habits that once sustained them. Resistance falters not through failure of people, but through failure of space. You notice how records change tone during this period. Chroniclers who once marvelled now write with grim familiarity. Fevers appear, epidemics flare. Death is recorded more often. Mass burials finally begin to appear, small at first, then larger. This is the moment myth struggles with most. If Tartarians were ever immune, how could this happen? The question itself reveals the misunderstanding. Immunity was never the story. Adaptation was. Adaptation requires freedom. When freedom narrows, adaptation suffers. You think about how war amplifies disease everywhere. How armies carry illness faster than caravans ever could. How sieges concentrate bodies in fear. How famine weakens resistance long before infection arrives. None of this is unique to Tartaria, and that is precisely the point. You see how the legend of exceptional resistance begins to unravel here, not into nothing, but into humanity. Tartarians suffer like others when placed under the same pressures. Their earlier resilience does not make them invulnerable. It makes them human beings living under specific conditions. Later storytellers will misinterpret this collapse. Some will say the Tartarians were wiped out by disease deliberately unleashed. Others will claim their bloodlines were diluted through mixing. Still others will argue that their technology was destroyed. These explanations all share a refusal to accept a quieter truth, that systems, not species, failed. You feel how uncomfortable that truth is. It suggests that resilience is conditional, that it must be maintained, that it can be lost without malice, without conspiracy, simply through change. You watch families adapt as best they can. Old habits persist in fragments. A little smoke here, a little space there, but fragments cannot carry the whole. You think about how modern society has experienced the same thing. When routines break, during disasters, wars, migrations, illness surges. Not because bodies change overnight, but because support structures vanish. The Tartarian story, once mythologized, now mirrors something deeply familiar. You sense the legend reshaping itself at this point. Early resilience becomes nostalgia. Nostalgia becomes proof of loss. Loss becomes myth, and myth hardens into belief. Some will say this period proves Tartaria was erased. Others will say it proves Tartaria never existed as imagined. Both arguments miss the lived reality unfolding quietly beneath them. You feel compassion here, not just for Tartarians, but for anyone who has watched something that worked slowly come apart. As night falls again, you see small fires struggling against wind in crowded spaces. Smoke no longer moves freely, breath tightens, illness lingers longer than before. The old rhythm is still remembered, but memory alone cannot substitute for environment. And yet even here you notice something enduring. Early response still helps, distance when possible still matters. Simple food still soothe, calm still eases recovery. The old wisdom does not vanish. It weakens, but it does not disappear. This matters, because it suggests that Tartarian resistance to disease was never an all-or-nothing phenomenon. It was a gradient, a spectrum, and even when pushed toward its limits, it left traces. You breathe slowly, letting the weight of this section settle. The myth of invulnerability dissolves, replaced by something more honest and more useful. Resilience is not a permanent state. It is a practice. As you move onward, the story prepares to turn again, away from Tartaria's collapse and toward its echo. You will soon step into the modern world, where the same ideas reappear wearing new names, and where the longing for immunity returns stronger than ever. But for now, you rest with this truth, gentle and grounding. What was lost was not magic but balance, and balance, once disturbed, always leaves consequences in the body of a people. You move onward, and without warning, the world around you begins to resemble your own. The steppe fades, the camps dissolve, stone, glass, and glowing screens rise quietly in their place. You feel the shift immediately, Lee, because the story has not ended, it has echoed. This is where Tartaria stops being history and becomes mirror. You hear familiar phrases now spoken with modern confidence. Natural immunity, strong constitutions. Those people don't get sick the same way. The words feel new, but the rhythm is ancient. You recognize it instantly. It is the same longing, resurfacing in a different age. You notice how quickly the Tartarian myth is pulled forward into the present. Online discussions, whispered conversations, late-night videos insist that some populations are simply more resistant. That modern illness is proof of degeneration, that ancient peoples knew something we lost or were something we are not. The pattern repeats. You feel how comforting this idea is. If others are naturally immune, then suffering becomes comparison rather than condition. If immunity is inherited, then effort feels futile. Responsibility dissolves. But you remember what you have seen. Modern myths of immunity often ignore environment just as older ones did. They overlook density, diet, stress, sleep, fear. They focus instead on identity. Who you are replaces how you live. You see how Tartaria is repurposed here. Not as a culture, but as proof. Proof that humans once lived without disease. Proof that something was taken. Proof that decline is inevitable. But you know better now. You have walked the habits. You have watched the systems break and reform. Decline is not inevitable. Neglect is. You think about how modern life mirrors the pressures that once strained Tartaria. Crowding, stillness, artificial rhythms, constant stimulation, chronic stress. Bodies sealed away from air, light, cold, heat, challenged only by fear, not by environment. And then we ask why illness spreads. You notice how resistance is framed today as identity rather than practice. People claim immunity through belief, through affiliation, through certainty. This is the most dangerous echo of all, because belief without habit creates overconfidence. Overconfidence invites exposure without preparation, and exposure without preparation leads to collapse. You recall how Tartarians never claimed invulnerability. They responded early. They spaced themselves, they rested, they adjusted. They did not declare immunity. They practiced resilience. Modern myths skip that part. They want the result without the rhythm, the protection without the patience, the outcome without the discomfort. You feel a quiet sadness here, not despair but recognition. The Tartarian story is not misused because people are foolish. It is misused because people are tired of effort, tired of uncertainty, tired of responsibility. Immunity sounds like rest, but real resilience requires attention. You see how easily ancient stories are weaponized. Tartaria becomes evidence in arguments rather than a lesson in living. Health becomes ideology. Bodies become symbols. And once again, the human disappears. You pause and breathe. You feel your own body responding to stillness, to breath, to awareness. You remember how adaptable you are, even now. This is the quiet power of the Tartarian echo. It reminds you that resilience was never lost completely. It was scattered, diluted, buried beneath convenience. You think about modern movements that unknowingly rediscover pieces of this. Cold exposure, fermented foods, breathwork, minimalism, spacing, early rest. They appear fragmented, marketed, isolated, but they point backward, whether they know it or not. Not to Tartaria as empire, but to Tartaria as pattern. You realize now that myths of ancient immunity persist because they express a truth poorly. Humans can live in ways that make disease less catastrophic, but that truth demands change. And change is harder than belief, so belief grows instead. You feel the story preparing to slow now, the sharp edges soften. The mirror no longer accuses, it invites. What if the real conspiracy was never erasure? What if it was distraction? What if the loudest stories about Tartaria, giants, machines, immunity exist to keep attention away from the quiet, inconvenient truth that resilience is built slowly, daily and personally? You let that thought drift without clinging to it. This is not a conclusion. It is an opening. As night deepens around you, the modern world dims slightly. The screens fade, the noise recedes. You are left with breath again, with space, with the same body humans have always carried. And you understand now that Tartaria's greatest legacy may not be something hidden behind walls or locked in archives, but something waiting patiently inside you, unchanged, asking only to be practiced. You move onward, and the story grows quieter, more spacious, as if preparing you for a question that cannot be answered loudly. The echoes of Tartaria, maps, habits, myths, machines, begin to arrange themselves into a single shape, not a conclusion, a reflection. This is where the grand question waits. You gather everything you have seen, the open plains, the moving camps, the early responses to illness, the food prepared patiently, the breath trained by cold and calm, the cities that breathed, the absence of mass graves, the collapse under pressure, the modern echoes of ancient certainty. And you ask yourself, gently, without urgency, what does this all say about humanity? The Tartarian people, once imagined as immune, now appear something else entirely, not protected by miracle, not elevated by secret blood, but living within a narrow window where balance held. A window that closes easily when space is taken, when fear replaces rhythm, when convenience replaces care. You feel how unsettling this is, because it suggests that disease has never been a simple enemy. It has been a messenger, revealing how we arrange our lives, how we treat space, how we handle stress, how quickly we respond to imbalance. The Tartarian story asks you to consider something uncomfortable. What if human fragility is not a flaw, but a signal? A signal that we are meant to live in dialogue with our environment, not sealed away from it. A reminder that bodies thrive on rhythm, not excess. That immunity is not a permanent state, but a moving relationship. You think about how often humanity searches for meaning in extremes. Absolute safety or absolute danger, total immunity or total collapse. The Tartarian myth sits right in the middle, refusing both. They were not invincible. They were not helpless. They were attentive. And attention, you realize, is rare. You reflect on how civilizations define progress. Taller buildings, denser cities, faster movement, constant availability, and yet each step forward quietly taxes the body. Breath shortens, sleep fragments, food simplifies, stress becomes background noise. Then disease arrives, and we are surprised. You feel how Tartaria disrupts this story. It suggests that progress without balance is not progress at all. That sophistication without restraint creates vulnerability, not strength. The grand question sharpens now. Are humans meant to conquer disease, or to coexist with it wisely? The Tartarian way, as myth and memory suggest, leaned toward coexistence. Illness was not denied but managed. Death was not banished but prevented from multiplying. Health was not worshipped but maintained quietly. You feel how different this is from modern thinking. Today, health often becomes identity. Immunity becomes status. Disease becomes moral failure or political weapon. The body becomes battlefield. But in the Tartarian rhythm, the body was home. Something to care for, not dominate. You consider the idea of engineered humanity, the ancient aliens, the planet-sized prisons, the cosmic explanations that hover around these stories. They are tempting because they lift responsibility off human shoulders. They suggest design rather than choice. But what you have seen whispers a quieter truth. Humans do not need to be redesigned to live resiliently. They need to be remembered remembered how to breathe, remembered how to move, remembered how to give space, remembered how to respond early, not dramatically. You feel the weight of that responsibility, and also its gentleness. This is not a demand for perfection, it is an invitation to attention. The Tartarian story does not ask you to believe in immunity. It asks you to question why you want to believe in it so badly. Is it fear of effort? Fear of uncertainty? Fear of accepting that health is not guaranteed, only supported? You sit with that fear without pushing it away. Fear is part of being human too. Tartarians did not erase it. They worked around it. As the night deepens, the grand question settles into a softer form. If a civilization once lived in a way that made disease less dominant, not absent but less powerful, what does that suggest about the future? Not about returning to the past, not about rejecting modern life, but about integrating what was once known intuitively. You sense the story beginning to slow its pace now, preparing you for rest rather than revelation. The answers, you realize, were never meant to arrive all at once. They arrive the way resilience does, gradually, quietly, through attention. You breathe slowly, feeling the question linger without demanding resolution. Humanity, fragile and adaptable, stands somewhere between myth and memory, not designed for perfection, but capable of balance. And as you let that thought drift gently beside you, the story prepares to soften, to dim, to release you from questions into something calmer. The final fire waits ahead, not to illuminate, but to warm. You move onward for the last time, and the journey narrows into something intimate and quiet. There are no new places to visit now, no new claims to examine. The wide steppe, the breathing cities, the fading myths, all of them draw closer together until they feel less like history and more like a single shared memory. This is the final campfire. You sit beside it, not as an observer anymore, but as a participant. The fire is small, controlled, enough to warm without overwhelming. Smoke rises briefly, then thins into the night. Above you, the sky is vast and untroubled, the same sky that once watched Tartarian camps shift and breathe and disappear without leaving scars. You realize how fitting this is. The story ends not with certainty, but with quiet. You think again of the phrase that started it all, resistant to disease, how heavy it sounded at first, how absolute, how tempting, and how different it feels now. Resistance, you see, was never a shield. It was a posture, a way of standing in the world without bracing against it too hard, a way of responding before panic arrived, a way of letting air, light, distance, and time do their work. You remember the caravans, how sickness did not spread because there was nowhere for it to gather. You remember the food, how nourishment was steady rather than indulgent. You remember the breath, slow and unafraid, meeting cold without drama. You remember the healers who did not announce themselves, and the cities that refused to trap what should move. You also remember the collapse. How quickly these advantages faded when space closed, when movement was restricted, when fear replaced rhythm. How disease returned, not as punishment, not as proof of weakness, but as consequence. And suddenly the story feels very close to you. You recognize the same forces shaping your own world, the same tension between comfort and resilience, the same longing for immunity without effort, the same hunger for stories that promise exemption rather than responsibility. The Tartarian people, once lifted into legend, settled gently back into humanity now. They were not untouched by death. They were not immune to suffering. They simply lived in ways that made catastrophe less likely, less loud, less defining. You feel how different that is from perfection. Perfection demands belief. Resilience demands practice. Belief is easy to inherit. Practice must be renewed every day. You sense now why the myth grew, why immunity was more attractive than balance, why machines were more exciting than habits, why erased books were easier to imagine than forgotten discipline. Balance asks something of you. It asks you to notice when breath shortens, to notice when stillness becomes stagnation, to notice when comfort becomes enclosure. It asks you to respond early, gently, without drama. The Tartarian story, stripped of its exaggerations, leaves you with a quiet offering rather than a revelation. It does not say, "This is how you must live." It whispers, "This is what once worked." And whether you believe it or not is up to you. You realize now that the story was never really about Tartaria. Tartaria was the shape the question took when history forgot how to ask it plainly. The real question has always been closer. How do humans live with their bodies instead of against them? How do communities protect one another without fear becoming the loudest voice? How do we accept fragility without surrendering to helplessness? The fire crackles softly. The answers do not arrive as words. They arrive as sensations, slower breath, loosened shoulders, a sense of space inside your chest. You understand now why this story was meant for bedtime, because its truth does not need daylight. It needs stillness. As the embers dim, you feel the journey settling into you, not as instruction, but as memory. Something you may recall later, unexpectedly. When you step into cold air, when you choose rest over urgency, when you leave space where you once would have crowded. That is how these things survive. Not as doctrine, not as conspiracy, but as quiet recollection. The night deepens, the fire fades, the land, the people, the myths all soften into shadow, no longer demanding belief, only attention. And now, before you drift fully into sleep, the story slows one last time. The pace softens now, like footsteps easing as you near home. Thoughts stretch out, unhurried. Words grow gentler, less insistent, as if they too are ready to rest. You no longer need to hold the story tightly. It has already done its work. You breathe in slowly and out again, feeling how simple that is and how easily it is forgotten. Your body right now is doing exactly what it has always known how to do. Adjust, respond, settle. You don't need immunity tonight. You don't need answers. You only need rest. The images fade, maps folding closed, fires turning to embers, wind smoothing away footprints. Tartaria becomes less a place and more a feeling. Openness, patience, quiet strength. Whatever was true, whatever was exaggerated, whatever was misunderstood. You can let it all drift. The night is wide enough to hold uncertainty without fear. Sleep arrives not as escape, but as repair. The same kind of repair that once happened under open skies, beside small fires, with breath slow and steady. There is nothing more you need to do, nothing to decide, nothing to prove, just rest. Let the mystery remain gentle. Let the questions soften. Let your thoughts slow until they dissolve into quiet. You are safe here in this moment, in this body, breathing as humans always have. The story has ended. End of script. Sweet dreams.